Hello, this is Charles Scoville, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Focus Friday here on the 17th of May. A couple things we want to cover today. First of all, quick area update. Second, want to talk about the question I'm getting about, is it time to consider switching to earlier hybrids if we haven't got it planted yet? Third, I've got a pest update. We're seeing some things out there. And finally, got a special guest to take a minute to look at nitrogen and how we need to be thinking about that this time of the year. So getting started right away here. First of all, if we go back to that early planted corn we've been talking about each week, the good news is that is real close to pushing V1. And I'll be honest with you, driving around the countryside, I'm seeing a lot of corn planted, a lot of soybeans planted, and I'm seeing a fair amount of crops starting to emerge out of the ground. So that's encouraging for those guys that have been able to find some dry ground to get on and get that crop in. I sure think we're better off than a lot of our friends in Indiana and Ohio right now. So that's good news. As far as the question on switching to earlier hybrids, we're sitting here the 17th of May, and that's not horrible. I'll be honest with you. I did the math. And that March 1st corn took 67 days to accumulate 120 heat units or enough to emerge. Now, if we forecast what's out here in the next 10 days between now and the 27th of May, we're going to also accumulate another 120 heat units. So, 10 days this time of the year is pretty easy to get corn emerged. So I just really struggle with the idea of switching. Now, granted, if we're sitting there with 114-day corn in mid-Michigan, yeah, we're probably thinking of something a little bit earlier. But if we're planting our normal maturing hybrids for this time of the year, there's actually been a pile of research done by the universities to say that, one, it just takes less time to emerge. And we know that by the heat units that we're getting now versus a month ago. But at the same time, corn actually finds that it requires less total heat units in order to hit maturity, and we plant a little later. And so, we've got a great plan in place. We've got the right hybrids on the right soils and the right situation. And so keeping that in place, my thought is always, Memorial Day, yeah, then we can start thinking about some switching the end of month here. But prior to that, we're just oftentimes in the risk of losing more than we're gaining by changing up those hybrids to earlier maturities. And so if you want to talk more about it, give me a call. We'll be happy to do so. Want to spend a minute also on pest update. So seed corn maggots have been showing up across the Midwest. I got first reports from Wisconsin, and then this week I got reports from Michigan on some of that earlier planted soybeans where we're seeing seed corn maggots. Now, we're scouting those, and we need to be scouting those early fields right now. You're going to look for feeding on the cotyledons. And if we feed through that growing point, that plant's going to die. And then, of course, we go back to the look of how many plants breaker we've got out there, either measuring the rows or throwing the hula hoop. And at the same time, if we don't have enough loss, it's probably worth leaving that stand out there. And we can work through that individually if you need to. But at the same time, the good news is those seed corn maggots have pretty much worked through their life cycle. And if we do have to replant, we should be safe. Also, getting reports of black cutworm flying in from the south on these storm fronts. They're looking for those fields that are green. So cover crops, heavy winter annuals, those things where they're going to lay their eggs. And of course, we're going to clean up those fields, plant them. And when they hatch, the only thing that's left for them to eat on is our crops. So we want to keep a good chance of scouting those fields that we knew were green early on for some potential black cutworm damage this year. So lots of great things going on. I want to jump into a special guest I have with us. I've invited Andy Heggenstaller, who's the head of agronomy here for Golden Harvest. When I think of nitrogen, I think of Andy Heggenstaller. He is just a tremendous expert on the topic. And so sometimes that can be a little confusing. Want to get him on here and welcome him to the show. Welcome, Andy. How are you?
Good, Charles. Happy Friday. Nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. We'll jump right into a couple of questions. The first one is, from your perspective, what are the challenges that are just inherent in corn nitrogen supply when it's related to things like crop, by soil, by weather dynamics out there?
I think that's the perfect place to start. Oftentimes, I think as you go into this, you assume that everybody knows this, and I think most of us do, but it's really important in terms to get to so what from a management perspective to appreciate how different nitrogen is from our other macronutrients that we think about in corn. The way I like to think about it is P and K, they're like a bank account. You put it in for the most part, and then what comes out is what you harvest off of the crop. There's some complexities, but by and large, that's how it works. Nitrogen doesn't work that way. We put it in, whether it's fertilizer or manure or other organic sources, and we do take it off with the crop. But at the meanwhile, there is a pool of organic nitrogen, so the soil organic matter that contains thousands. If you had, for example, a 2 to 3% organic matter soil, there are several thousand pounds per acre of nitrogen potentially there. And the question is, based on temperature, moisture, soil texture, management practices, how much of that organic nitrogen that becomes available each year is highly variable. At the same time, how much nitrogen we lose from the soil is highly variable too. Our P and K are attached to the cation exchange capacity in the soil, and in most cases, they're not going to go anywhere where nitrogen's negatively charged. Therefore, it does not adhere to the soil. And if we get a lot of moisture moving down through the soil, or we get ponding and anaerobic conditions, we can lose that nitrogen. So if fertility is a bank account, P and K is like make a deposit, make a withdrawal. In the case of nitrogen, you can make your deposits and your withdrawals, but depending on your soil management and weather, there might be a robber coming in and taking some of it, or there might be an angel investor that you don't know about that's coming and making deposits. So it just gets much more complicated than those nutrients. And we need to think about the supply dynamics differently.
Yep, so true. And I think that's why I really wanted you on here now, because it's just so much more complex than the P and K side of the world. When we think about nitrogen timing and possibly split application, what's been your experience or the research you've seen on the ROI, return on investment there for nitrogen timing and split application?
Yeah. So, like everything in our profession, Charles, we always start, we get picked on a lot for this as agronomists, right? It depends. And so it does. But let's talk about what does it depend on? I would say in general, I am a strong supporter of split applications of nitrogen, and I'll tell you why in a second. But as we think about my experiences, both with trials that I've managed or farmers I've worked with or research that I'm familiar with, to be completely honest, the bulk of my experience in the literature would say, just generally speaking, split applications of nitrogen are more about risk mitigation than they are pushing, a new top end yield with corn. There are obviously exceptions, but if we look at it in general, I'm aware of the most thorough study that's ever been done in the Midwest to my knowledge. It just so happens that study was done in some average to drier years, which is important to note, found that about 3/4 of the time, a split application of nitrogen was similar to a spring application of nitrogen at the same rate, whereas about 25% of the time it yielded more. Had those studies been done in really wet years, I expect that the results would look different. And that's why I go back and say I think about it as a risk management perspective. There are going to be years, let's think about at least where I live in Northern Illinois, we had very, not like drought, but we had very dry or low, not heavy rainfall moisture conditions during May and June. What happens with temperature and moisture in May and June is absolutely determines what happens with nitrogen. When we have conditions between about right now that the soil's warm, we've got mineralization going, we got mid 50-degree soil temperatures. If we are average to below average in moisture between now and the 4th of July, split applications of nitrogen, all else equal, aren't going to give us a tremendous amount of benefit over a spring application. But if between now and the 4th of July, we continue, which we will, to have warm soil temperatures, but we get heavy rainfall, especially when we get those really heavy rainfalls and long periods of soil saturation, then the split application is going to pay. So that's, again, I go back, think about it of managing my risk. In any given year, the benefit of it will vary, but over the long term, we both know that we're going to encounter those years between mid-May and the 4th of July that are really wet. And in those years, that split application, all else equal, will benefit us. I also, last point I'll make on that is just important to think about that about 10% of all the nitrogen that corn will take up will be taken up between the time it emerges and we get to V6. So we're in the midpoint or early point of that right now. We're talking about 10%, for 200 bushel corn, we're talking about 15 pounds of nitrogen or so is all it is, maybe 20 pounds.
Yep.
And then between V6 and R1, 50 to 60%, 100 to 120 some pounds of nitrogen will be taken up during that period, mid-vegetative, early vegetative through reproductive. And then the other, what would that be? 30, 35% will
Yep.
get taken up after R1. And so that's the logic of the side dress idea, right? Sometime between V6 and R1, let's put nitrogen into the system when we know the demand is the highest. But again, I like to think of it as risk mitigation, and how beneficial it is to me will depend on the year and what the rainfall patterns look like in the early summer.
Well, that's great advice, and we certainly get those years where we see that happen, and rain that we don't expect, losing some of that nitrogen out there. So, speaking of nitrogen, boy, the most common thing we hear anytime we hear the word nitrogen is everybody follows that up with the word sulfur. And so, I guess I'm curious on your perspective on that sulfur nitrogen relationship, and what do we need to be doing with sulfur and nitrogen together?
Right. No, I agree. Those two go hand in hand. It feels like since maybe mid 2000s, this issue has become much more forefront, especially since 2010. And of course, we know, and your listeners, many of them will know, that's due to changes in air quality standards that have reduced, from an environmental beneficial standpoint, the amount of acid rain and sulfur that's coming down in the rainfall. What we know is that I'll talk about it two different ways. They're both right. They're not mutually exclusive. Is that generally that 200 plus bushel corn crop that we're thinking about, it's going to take somewhere in that 25 to 40 pounds of sulfur. But like nitrogen, sulfur can be supplied from the soil. In fact, if we think about all the major macro and secondary nutrients that our crop's going to take up, sulfur is the most similar to nitrogen in how it behaves in the soil and how the plant metabolizes it. And so that's oftentimes why we think of them together. So the first way I would think about it is we're looking to somewhere in that 30 pounds of sulfur as a good number. That'll vary depending on your soil organic matter. And some of those same situations I just managed with nitrogen. If you have high organic matter, it's warm and it's moist, but it's not saturated, you would need less sulfur from fertilizer because the soil would end up having a net positive contribution. On the other hand, if it was heavy rainfall and we lose a lot of sulfur this time of year, and or we have lower organic matter soils, we'll need to apply more sulfur. I think where I see the best managers moving is when I apply nitrogen, I'm going to apply sulfur. So I think if you're going to apply nitrogen twice, apply sulfur twice. If you're going to put urea down up front, put some AMS or something like that with it. If you're going to use 28 or 32% liquid for a V6 to VT side dress, Y drop, what have you, put some ammonia thiosulfate with that. I think the ratio, if we want to think about it in a total amount, again, I think somewhere in that 30 pounds. Different people will tell you differently, and they'll tell you differently based on the soils they're dealing with. But the other way to think about it is for every 6 to 10 pounds of nitrogen, put a pound of sulfur. As we get into those lighter textured soils, let's err toward more like that 1 pound of sulfur for every 6 pounds of nitrogen. As we get into higher organic matter soils or situations where we have not historically seen issues with sulfur, let's get closer to 1 pound of sulfur for every 10 pounds of nitrogen. But absolutely, I think it's a key part, and sulfur and nitrogen should be thought of as one or together when we're thinking about corn fertility.
Excellent advice. I always think of it like potatoes and gravy. If I'm going to have potatoes, I want some gravy along with it.
Right. That's
So,
right.
hey, as we wrap up things here today, I like to think about what's actionable right now. So, in your estimation, what really matters most this week about nitrogen in your mind?
So specifically, that would depend on the farmer or manager I was talking to, right? And I've spent enough time, Charles, with you in Michigan, and thanks for all the time you've spent introducing me to your seed advisors and farmers there. And one of the things I've learned about Michigan compared to some other places like Iowa, Illinois, or Minnesota, where I've lived, is there's a lot of variability in how farmers in Michigan manage their corn, right? We have dairy farmers, we have some extremely sophisticated precision type farmers, and then we have people doing what maybe we would say just kind of more standard management of let's put urea on and plant corn. So what I would say specifically would vary depending on which one of those farmers I was talking to. But here's the central theme that would be in my mind no matter who I was having the conversation with. And I'll just go back to right now as we look on the 17th of May, our corn crop needs very little nitrogen. We are not at any risk, no matter within reason, what's happening out there today with nitrogen. But as we approach V6, be thinking about however I'm managing, am I set up, even just from a simple mass balance approach in terms of what have I applied, what's the yield goal that I've set, can I supply my soil and my fertility or manure program? Am I set up to be able to supply 100 to 130 pounds of nitrogen between V6 and R1? As I've heard you say before, even if I'm not set up to supply that, most of our soils in Michigan that we're growing corn on are going to find a way to get that done. Maybe they'll come up a little short, but if they don't, then the problem we get into is we need another 60 pounds during R1 to R6, right? And if we don't have it set up that at R1 we're in a good spot, this plant's going to start to cannibalize itself. It's going to start firing. Even if we don't have, drier conditions, we're going to have stock quality issues. We're going to reduce yield. So if we can get this crop to R1, in my experience, in most agricultural soils in the Midwest, we will win the nitrogen game. So be thinking, where's my next 120 pounds of nitrogen going to come from before flowering? That'd be my general advice.
Well, Andy, excellent advice as always. And again, appreciate your perspective on nitrogen as we think about certainly growing this year, again, the best crop possible. So as we wrap up here today, just want to thank everybody for joining us. And again, this is Charles Scoble, your Golden Harvest agronomist with your Focus Friday. Have a great week.